So the shots have been fired, the banners have been called. We're on to round 2, boys. So about 20 years ago, it's one of the most notorious.
A hell of a wait.
Yeah. It's one of the most notorious clips of political discourse, I think, that the internet has, which is the initial meeting of Tucker Carlson and Jon Stewart on Crossfire back in the days when Tucker Carlson was still wearing his bow tie.
I remember it well.
I haven't got the clip, but it's easy enough to find. Jon Stewart comes on and begins to berate them, accuse them of diluting the political discussion, of being shills for the Republican Party. And to be perfectly fair to him, as much as I think that his points were completely vacuous and he was immediately going back to his "I'm just a comedian" defense the second that Tucker Carlson shot back, Tucker and his co-host, I don't know who he was, didn't really have a very good response to it. They kind of were trying to be polite. They laughed along. They threw a few jabs here and there, but they didn't make a good show of defending themselves. And it was a few months after that, I believe, that Crossfire was either cancelled or Tucker was fired from it. And a lot of people use this as something to gloat these days and say, haha, see, Jon Stewart destroyed them. Tucker Carlson got destroyed by Jon Stewart. But I think there's something to be said for the long game. And we can see in the long term whose career has come out better. And realistically as well, when it comes to journalism, Jon Stewart's big complaint was the fact that you were just being mouthpieces, that you were being shills. Who's actually engaged in real journalism these days? Who's going out interviewing world leaders like Putin? I know that was a very controversial decision that he made, but Tucker Carlson is reasonably doing the thing that you would expect a journalist to do, which is going to the opposition leader and saying, okay, what's your side of the story here? In the interests of public debate and public knowledge, we should have a more open discussion about this. And what's Jon Stewart doing? Well, Jon Stewart recently returned to The Daily Show because The Daily Show lost Trevor Noah, who was an abysmal replacement and nobody missed him. And since then, they've had a very poor job finding a proper replacement for him. I think they had a replacement in line for Trevor Noah already, but he got in trouble for either plagiarism or something along those lines. So The Daily Show had some bad trouble. So they said, right, okay, we need to bring the big guns back in. We need to bring Jon Stewart back in. And what was it that Jon Stewart decided to do? Jon Stewart decided to go straight back to his old routine of shilling for the regime. Realistically, being the mouthpiece of the Democratic establishment, feigning some kind of moderate take on things where he's positioning himself in the center of the discourse, whereas in reality, he's actually quite far on the left of the discourse. I would say he's always been this way. It's just since the political sides have been so polarized, more and more clear these days. And we've had years and years of people like John Oliver doing his same routine to the point where we know that it's a refined, almost laboratory refined format. The Daily Show and other late night talk shows that position themselves relatively political. That's how they operate. And I think this is the second episode he came back, he decided that he was going to comment on Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin, and more particularly, his thing that we covered recently, Callum, where Tucker Carlson went around Russia and said, look, there's no graffiti, there's no people urinating in the streets. I can walk through a supermarket and nobody's robbing anything.
The things they had that are nice, they kept them nice.
Yes, how can a country do this? And Jon Stewart decided that he was going to respond to it in his typical bad faith manner. So let's watch this.
Right. Because the difference between our urinal-caked, chaotic subways and your candelabred, beautiful subways is the literal price of freedom. But the goal that Carlson and his ilk are pushing is that there's really no difference between our systems. In fact, theirs might be a little bit better. The question is, why? Why is Tucker doing this? Here's why. It's because the old civilizational battle was communism versus capitalism. That's what drove the world since World War II. Russia was the enemy then. But now they think the battle is woke versus unwoke. And in that fight, Putin is an ally to the right. He's their friend. Unfortunately, he is also a brutal and ruthless dictator. So now they have to make Americans a little more comfortable with that. I mean, liberty is nice, but have you seen Russia's shopping carts? And Tucker would have gotten away with it if it weren't for those meddling assassins.
In a statement to the New York Times, Carlson said, quote, "It is horrifying what happened to Navalny. The whole thing is barbaric and awful. No decent person would defend it."
Correct. No decent person would.
So I'm glad to see that good faith debate and discourse is back on the table. Thank you very much, Jon Stewart. So everybody knows the routine by now. People have been pointing it out. It's this old Martin Bailey has said here. Tucker Carlson praises the fact that Russia has clean and operating infrastructure. Jon Stewart says the only reason they do that is because they assassinate political dissidents like Navalny. That means that you're supporting the assassination of political dissidents, Tucker. That's not what Tucker was saying. That's not what Tucker was supporting.
That's not how subways work.
And
They don't get prettier the more people you kill.
Also, shockingly enough, for a long stretch of time, America was able to have a great degree of political and public liberty without things having degenerated to the point where they have now. Because what we have in the West, in America, and in Europe, and in England, is not the result of political liberty. It is the result of hostile elites forcing bad results on us, forcing bad policy, forcing mass immigration on us, refusing to do anything, victimizing and persecuting people who actually speak up about it and try to do something about it. And Jon Stewart, as ever, is acting as the shill for that establishment, that hostile elite that hates us, because Jon Stewart, despite the fact that, yes, guess what he did? He criticized Joe Biden for saying that he's old. He's old and senile, and people go, ha, finally we have the moderate centrist back in place who's willing to criticize both sides. That is not what someone like Jon Stewart is doing there. He is speaking directly to his pals in the Democrat establishment, saying this makes us look really bad if we have someone in charge who is obviously senile, who is a walking bag of bones, a zombie who can't speak for himself anymore. So he's signaling to them, get him out of the way, put somebody who's a better figurehead for us, and then that'll give us better results. It's not him actually presenting any kind of legitimate, real criticism for anything other than optics.
I know it's a sort of a lesser point, but was it just me, or did Jon Stewart come across there as really condescending and patronising and smug at the same time? Just, I don't know, the whole tone of it has just seemed.
I mean, that's what he's always done. As far as even when
it just seems worse now, if anything.
I think it's because it's clearer. But when you go back and watch the older clips of him, which I have done a few times, he's the same back then. I think people were more on his side because of how unpopular a lot of George W. Bush's presidential policies and foreign policy in particular was. He was kind of speaking for the vast majority of people, because people on the left and the right could recognize that George Bush was making some very poor decisions. Whereas now, because we have much greater levels of polarization in the public sphere, someone like Jon Stewart comes across as exactly what he is, which is a shill.
I'd like to see Tucker rock the bow tie again, at least just once.
He brings it back on, comes on for a debate with Jon Stewart.
I'm easily old enough to remember that original thing. I was already an adult. I clearly, absolutely remember it. And I remember at the time, more or less siding with Jon Stewart as well. During the early 2000s, I was sort of, I was like most other people, kind of against George Bush Jr. and Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and all those guys. And so if someone like Jon Stewart was railing against them and hadn't revealed themselves as a complete insane, whatever they are, globalist or something, so I'd be
anti-white activists,
right?
Because
they weren't revealed as that yet. So most people, I certainly was not strongly in favour, but I would be more on Jon Stewart's side than Tucker Carlson at that time, I must admit.
But like we say, since then the veil has fallen.
Oh God, yeah.
And we can all see him for who he is. Since he was off the Daily Show, he was doing his other show, The Problem with Jon Stewart, and one of the most notorious episodes of that was The Problem with White People.
Yeah, gosh.
So,
which people then started Photoshop to be The Problem with Jewish People, and he was like, "That's disgusting. How could you do this?" And I was like, "Bro, you literally just did one about whites. I'm sorry. I have no sympathy."
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit more? I hate to stick on it.
No, carry on.
That point of the price of freedom is living in filth.
It never used to be.
Yeah. Does it have to be?
In fact, the price of freedom a lot of the time in the past was an improved living conditions.
But also, it's not just a statement on the past. It's a prediction for the future there, which is, yes, dear viewers, your future will be more filth, as we get freer.
As we get freer and freer, things will get more and more filthy. The crime rates will rise exponentially. Aren't you so glad? Because that's the point as well.
But it's not a terrible argument even from his side, where he's like, well, if you go live in China, things will be great. Wouldn't that be awful? It's like, what? Is that actually how you think?
If this is the price of Jon Stewart's conception of freedom, then why would anybody choose to be free? So you're making a great argument for slavery, completely by accident, John. Fantastic. I mean, not that I believe that what he's promoting is any sort of freedom that anybody in the classical world would ever recognize. What he's supporting is top-down, almost dictatorial control, except it has a nice media veneer over the top of it saying, this is you being free.
Free and fair, free and fair.
In all sorts of ways, the sort of shadowy oligarchies that rule the Russian Federation and the United States, there's all sorts of similarities there, right?
There are absolutely similarities.
So, yeah, one is fairly safe and clean and the other one isn't.
Oh, I mean, that's as we move on, that's some of the points that I'm going to bring up. But
Hi, folks, sorry to interrupt the video, but Bo and I have just completed a 3-part series on one of my favourite English kings, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. Now, one of the things about doing this series is that we get to lay out what actually happened, in contrast to some perhaps more famous Hollywood movies that tell you total lies about what actually occurred. So if you'd like to know what actually happened with the invasion of Scotland, multiple invasions of Scotland, did the Irish just defect to the Scots because of brotherly love? Well, come and sign up to lotus.com and find out.
On the point of the format being so clearly transparent now, there's this 4chan text that goes around, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is the right-wing version of the Warlow text meme, but I am going to read some of it. So he's talking about John Oliver's show, and John Oliver was an associate of The Daily Show. I think he made contributions there. He knows Jon Stewart, and he moved on to do his Last Week Tonight show, and which follows the exact same format. And it just
do we as Brits owe all Americans something of an apology?
They want to send him back, but I don't want him back.
Yeah. No returns.
But we've, as an ethnic group, we've done a lot of bad to American television. I mean,
Piers
James
Morgan
Corden
was over there for a while.
Yeah,
James Corden,
John Oliver, Piers Corden. I mean, I don't know if
Piers Corden. Oh, that's the worst combination ever.
I don't know if we can really claim Mehdi Hassan, but he went over there and poisoned their airways.
Can we send them all to Rwanda?
I hope.
Maybe. But this is how scientific and down to a T it is. They all follow the same format, as he says. Present some argumentation and facts for 10 seconds. Quickly follow this up with a snarky quip, which themselves overwhelmingly take the form of a complete non sequitur or otherwise absurd metaphor, before any rational processing of the preceding argument can take place in the mind of the viewer. Further telling is that the only beats or mental pauses that the show takes exist solely to highlight the approving laughter or applause of the studio audience. Repeat this basic formula without variation about 20 to 40 times in a row, and you have one 12 to 20 minute segment that form the backbone of the show. And that is an amazing technique, far more effective, I would say, than anything that any intelligence service in Soviet Russia or anywhere else that would be described as totalitarian came up with for brainwashing a public population, a mass population, because you are applying a number of factors all at once. You're providing entertainment, you're making people think that they're being informed while they're being entertained, and you're also applying the perception of mass pressure, social pressure on these people through the laughter, which of course everybody knows if you look at the studios, it's a sign that lights up and says laugh. Because these jokes aren't actually funny. But you're watching it and you feel like you're part of a group and you feel like you have to conform to that group. And when you go out into public, you could be surrounded by dozens of people who all, like you, disagree with any points that he's making. But none of you know that. All you know is that you watched the TV last night and the funny ha-ha man gave particular opinions that got laughed about. And so you have to conform to that.
Once you've read this, sincerely, read that and then go and watch an old episode of John Oliver's show. Because I did this after reading that and I realized, oh crap, it's right on the money.
Yeah.
It's funny how another example of how things degenerate and just get worse over time. Again, showing my age. I remember when it was sort of Jay Leno and David Letterman used to sort of rule the TV late night show comedy man thing. Like David Letterman, of course, he'd probably have a team of people actually writing his monologues and things, but Jay Leno, but particularly Letterman, was actually funny. Often, it was actually a funny monologue. It wasn't just pure, sort of snarky activism. It was actual jokes.
I have to take your word for it because I've not seen that much of those guys back.
Letterman was a genuinely good stand-up comedian, right?
I mean, that helps.
Was John Oliver ever a genuinely funny stand-up? I don't know. I actually don't know, but I doubt it.
The only thing I've ever really laughed at that John Oliver was involved in was, I mentioned Community in the previous segment. He did play a character for a few episodes on that, but that was somebody else writing him being funny. That wasn't him being funny. He was reading somebody else's lines.
Like Letterman was people like Seinfeld or Larry David praise Letterman as being a superbly funny dude. So yeah, he could do a monologue. And now we're left with this weird remnant, these weird ashes of nothingness that's left.
It does feel like it's running on fumes. The very fact that they had to bring out Jon Stewart in the first place, who at this point is like an old media relic from 20 to 30 years ago now. He quit. He quit The Daily Show back in 2015. And now they've just like dug up the corpse, plopped it back on the chair, and he's doing the same old routine that he ever was, and everybody can see through it now. But of course, the media decide to come out and praise it, say, oh, isn't it so good that they did this? And they're all harping on the same point as well, which is that Tucker Carlson just praised the regime. Well, he didn't praise a regime. He went to a supermarket and said, oh my God, it's clean. And then he went to a subway station and said, oh my God, it's clean. He didn't say, I fully endorse every decision that Vladimir Putin has ever made, but they want to draw that comparison.
It's even worse because he explicitly stated this station was built by Stalin, probably one of the worst people ever. And then you've got I think he says, then you've got Vladimir Putin, who also is not someone I support. And then goes on to explain, and yet they have these things.
Yeah. You can be a bad person and maintain nice things for a population, or you can be
a good person and also do that.
Yeah. But in the
United
West,
States is not run by either of those options.
We have bad people who do bad things constantly and don't maintain anything.
In Russia, they don't have to keep the sort of toiletries and sports drink under lock and key.
Yeah,
I mean,
but not the sun cream.
Yeah.
And another thing, just for anybody who wasn't aware, so just to give some
sun cream in Russia.
Good point.
Gets hot in Crimea in the summer.
So for context, the event that they're trying to draw this comparison to was the fact that Putin had jailed one of his political enemies, this man, Alexei Navalny, who was the leader of an opposition party who had criticized Putin's foreign aggression in areas like Crimea in the past. He had previously, was that what it was?
I'm pretty sure he was on side for that.
Oh, was he on side for that? He criticized some of the more recent
Most of his stuff is that he hates Vladimir Putin and his party because he calls them corrupt.
Oh, well.
So,
I mean,
when it came to the foreign policy, the Ukrainians actually kind of hate him because he supported taking Crimea.
Oh, fair
and
play.
Supporting Donbass.
Yeah, I got that wrong in that case. Thank you for the correction there. So I'll just read some of this so you can get the picture. Western leaders have held Vladimir Putin directly responsible for the death of the Russian opposition Alexei Navalny, as the US President Joe Biden called it yet more proof of Putin's brutality. I'm surprised he didn't just say Putler. You know, this is another sign of Putler's insane madness. If we don't stop him now, he's going to end up on our borders for some reason. We best start World War III.
Vladimir Pooty Poot. Do you remember? George Bush Jr. literally called Putin.
Of course he did.
Pooty Poot.
Yeah. Right. Now, Navalny, 47, died while being held in a jail about 40 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where he'd been sentenced to 19 years under a special regime. Russia has claimed Navalny died of natural causes. In a statement, the Federal Penitentiary Service for the region where Navalny was incarcerated said he felt unwell after a walk and almost immediately lost consciousness. All necessary resuscitation measures were carried out but did not yield positive results, the statement said. Paramedics confirmed the death of the convict. The Kremlin said Putin had been informed but had no further information. So, okay, yeah, sure. All right, guys, yeah. He went for a walk, got real cold, and then died, guys. All right. Okay, sure. If you say so, guys. I mean,
one thing I did want to say, because I've written a couple of articles against Zelensky. And a few times I've been on camera. When we had Tim Davies on the other day, we you could think that we were sort of pro-Russia or some way. I do want to make clear that Putin is a killer. Like, absolutely. Like Litvinenko, I'm at risk of getting Novichok myself, even saying such a thing. He definitely has ordered the murder of journalists and political rivals.
Of course he has. I mean, this is a clear example of it. Let's be honest. Obviously, political dissenter, head of an opposition party, you find some reason, trumped up charges to put him in prison, and then while he's in prison, he just happens to die. He just happens to keel over while you're keeping him, 40 miles north of the Arctic Circle.
And there's loads of examples. Wasn't there some Russian opposition guy that was shot on a bridge in the middle of Moscow?
Vladimir Nemtsov.
Right. So Putin's got previous.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys ever know the story of that one, because that one's amazing. So he's the leader of the opposition in the early days of Putin. And he's walking on the bridge next to Red Square, going home with his girlfriend. And a garbage truck pulls up near them. And then all of a sudden, all of the security cameras for a mile just turn off. Thankfully, there's one attached to the library, which was overlooking the bridge, which is privately owned, that worked. And you see in the footage, the garbage truck comes into view, goes in front of the guys, and then someone runs into a car with a gun and drives off. And then as the garbage truck goes past, Nemtsov is just dead on the floor. When I was in Russia...
Who knows what could have happened there?
Well, I asked a Russian guy, because there's still a memorial there to this day that the people who are supporting make sure is kept to be remembered. So I asked a guy who was with us the first time I went to Russia. I was like, so what's this about? And he just looked at me and went, Chechen terrorists.
He knew the line. He knew what to say.
That's what he said.
Yeah, so Biden in 2021 promised devastating consequences for Russia if Navalny were to die behind bars. However, it's not clear what could restrain Putin. And this is editorializing from The Guardian here. What could restrain Putin from a further crackdown on Navalny's supporters in Russia and abroad? So, as far as I can tell, this seems to be escalating rhetoric to say, like, if we don't do something, ground invasion, send Western forces over there, Putin might further crack down on his political opposition. Okay.
I'm maybe going to say something unpopular here, but I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
I just don't give a shit about Alexei Navalny in the same way I don't give a shit about the guy the Saudis assassinated or Coach Red Pill getting killed by the Ukrainians. I don't give a fuck. I'm sorry, I really hate this stuff. When actually, now we need to invade someone. It's just like some foreigner gets killed by foreign regime.
Well, that's the point that I'm about to make, actually, because it's not like Western regimes don't do the same thing. You mentioned Coach Red Pill. He died in the custody of the Ukrainian police. And
there's an argument there because we give them 60 billion. So it's like, give back our citizen. But if it's your own people, like the Saudis killing their own people or the Russians or the Chinese, it's like...
what seems to have happened
me to do exactly?
From the information from this and what I already knew as well, Gonzalo Lira, Coach Red Pill, was living in Ukraine with his family when the war broke out and decided that he was going to become a critic of it within the country itself, which is a really stupid idea. A really stupid thing to do.
Actually dumb if you do this.
But what they did in May 2023, they arrested him, they put him in prison. He wrote about, I think he corresponded with his father and wrote notes saying about how he'd contracted pneumonia. He was being neglected. They tried to torture him and extort him for $70,000, and then he died. And it was very clearly, as far as I can tell, either neglect or purposeful on the side of the Ukrainian forces. But you could say, yeah, he was doing something really stupid. Of course, they're going to punish him for that. But at the same time, you could make the same argument for this guy when it's an obviously hostile regime that you're under who have killed people before, to stand against that. This is the thing that...
Well, it's bad news, but it's just not my people.
Yeah,
or my government, so I don't...
This is the thing that hostile forces do to dissenters. They imprison you, and then while you're in prison, you die. And this is the same in Russia. This is the same over in the West as well. In America...
But do you remember Khashoggi? Khashoggi was a Saudi dissident, and he was in Turkey. They just had him killed.
There you go.
I think they chopped him up, didn't they, in a basement somewhere?
Yeah, and everyone was like, okay.
The thing is, I actually agree with you. If the Chinese kill Chinese dissidents or Russians kill Russian dissidents, it's their problem. I might disapprove of it.
A terrible shame.
Or frown or wag my finger, but
I've got tea to make.
I actually, yeah.
The difference is that we're not globalists.
I was going to say two things though. One is when it spills out into someone else's country, like Khashoggi, the fact that it was in Turkey does make it more egregious to me. Litvinenko, okay, the fact that it was in London does make it a bit...
I'm not saying that that's the case. Sure.
Well, obviously, it's the foreign agents within foreign countries.
And the other thing which I find most alarming about this, the general tone, the general narrative of ramping up the narrative of we're going to have a full-blown war with Russia, is that they don't seem to remember that Russia's got the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. It does completely change the dynamic. It's not like building a coalition against Saddam, building a coalition against Yemen. No, Russia could induce a nuclear winter if it could nuke Paris or London or whatever, or Moscow.
Well, with that,
or
you've got
Washington.
You've got to bank on the West's leaders not being completely insane and run by senile people, but that's kind of up in the air.
To be fair, I don't think they'll risk that.
No,
their houses get blown up.
That's the thing. Would either side risk nuclear war, or would it be ground skirmishes, or even drone warfare? I don't know, because I'm not some guy who's really up to date on.
But someone like Blinken or Biden or Rishi or whoever, they never address them. I've never seen them ever sort of address the possibility of a nuclear exchange.
I take comfort in the fact that the people who run countries are incredibly rich and like it being the rich people. So they're not going to actually do something as stupid as get their own house blown up. Like, they'll blow up.
Hopefully.
The youth of their country, they'll happily get killed, but their own houses.
Yeah, but if
the way it's always been.
But if they're about to die, if they're on their last legs anyway, they're 110 years old, and God damn it, they just want to see Iran nuked before they die. Like Lindsey Graham. Like Lindsey Graham is saying, we've just got to nuke Iran, guys. All the world's problems will be solved when we nuke Iran. Are you insane enough to actually do that? Are you insane enough to do that?
I think I should clarify, because I got a bit heated there about the people being killed thing. You're right. Like, if there's another country involved in the situation, it's obviously more complex. But I got a bit annoyed with just everyone talking about Navalny, and you check up when have you ever tweeted about Navalny on Twitter, and it was today and never before. And it's like,
well, once again, to clarify,
I don't know who Nemtsov is. Like, you're just not involved in this.
I think the point that we're making is that none of the three of us are globalists. We're not dedicated to the crusade of spreading democracy across the world so that everybody can all be living in harmony, holding hands.
Unless it's against the bugs.
Yeah.
Freedom is the only way.
That's nothing I'm interested in. If there are brutal dictatorships in North Korea, I mean, as long as they're not going to be nuking us, they can have their brutal dictatorship. I don't need to have regime change.
What do you want me to do? I don't trade with them.
Exactly.
I've got no interaction.
I'm interested in the well-being of my own people in my own nation and the level of political freedom that we experience here. That's what I'm interested in. And once again, with the US, they also jail their political dissidents. Josh has spoken directly to people who've been imprisoned after January 6th. This was Jake Lang. It's a very interesting interview, so you should check it out. But I think to cap all of this off on the Tucker Carlson versus Jon Stewart, and who's actually doing journalism these days, this is a really interesting interview that Tucker Carlson had a few days ago. It was about 5 days ago now, where he spoke to a man called Mike Benz, who I found out through researching for this, he was a member of Trump's State Department, and he was also operating for a while as an anonymous YouTube account and poster called Frame Game Radio, where he spoke a lot about how the system works, how markets are manipulated, how foreign agencies and foreign countries have regime change and such done to them. And he got doxxed, essentially. Reporters looked into him and found that the life story of this guy, Mike Benz, lined up pretty perfectly with the personal details that Frame Game Radio had given on his YouTube channel. And as such, he got doxxed. He came out and said, yes, I was this guy. But then he tried to put a little smoke screen in front of himself and said, well, I only did this YouTube channel because I was trying to de-radicalize people. Okay, Mike. But Tucker Carlson had him on. And as part of this, he gave a lot of really fascinating information about how the government controls information, the US government in collusion with the European Union in Brussels and elsewhere. They collude with private companies. They use extortion tactics. They use the control of information through the flow of the internet to as a tool of foreign regime change, and also as a tool of preventing populist uprisings, particularly in Europe. And I would really recommend, I've got 2 clips for this. They're quite long, so I hope we don't run over with this, but we can run over a little bit.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, we can run over a little bit because they're really fascinating. They give a lot of information. And in the course of a single hour here, Mike Benz is able to clearly and concisely explain a lot of how the system works. And we know that he was in Trump's State Department. He's got a lot of insider information. He has personally been in these departments that he's talking about. He's had personal contact with these people that he's talking about. So he's kind of spilling the beans here a lot. And if you've been paying attention over the past few years, some of the information will be very familiar to you. But having it all laid out over the course of a single hour is a remarkable achievement that Tucker Carlson has been able to put out to the world. So let's watch this clip, the first one I've got here.
Sure. You know, one of the easiest ways to actually start the story is really with the story of internet freedom and its switch from internet freedom to internet censorship, because free speech on the internet was an instrument of statecraft almost from the outset of the privatization of the internet in 1991. We quickly discovered through the efforts of the Defense Department, the State Department, and our intelligence services that people were using the internet to congregate on blogs and forums. And free speech was championed more than anybody by the Pentagon, the State Department, and our sort of CIA cutout NGO blob architecture as a way to support dissident groups around the world in order to help them overthrow authoritarian governments as they were sort of billed. Essentially, the internet free speech allowed kind of insta-regime change operations to be able to facilitate the foreign policy establishment's State Department agenda. Google is a great example of this. Google began as a DARPA grant by Larry Page and Sergey Brin when they were Stanford PhDs. And they got their funding as part of a joint CIA-NSA program to chart how, quote, birds of a feather flock together online through search engine aggregation. And then 1 year later, they launched Google and then became a military contractor quickly thereafter. They got Google Maps by purchasing a CIA satellite software, essentially. And the ability to use free speech on the internet as a way to circumvent state control over media in places like Central Asia or all around the world was seen as a way to be able to do what used to be done out of CIA station houses or out of embassies or consulates in a way that was totally turbocharged. And all of the internet free speech technology was initially created by our national security state. VPNs, virtual private networks, to hide your IP address. Tor, the dark web, to be able to buy and sell goods anonymously. End-to-end encrypted chats. All of these things were created initially as DARPA projects or as joint CIA-NSA projects to be able to help intelligence-backed groups to overthrow governments that were causing a problem to the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the Obama administration. And this
I mean,
what are you going to do?
What do we need to add to all that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the origins of Google. But I wrote an article quickly, quickly. I wrote an article a little while ago called, I think I called it "In the Shadow of Mockingbird," where back in the 50s
he
and
references
60s,
Operation Mockingbird.
Right.
It goes back to the start of the CIA after it was changed from the OSS.
The OSS, right? Yeah. So there's things like CBS News, for example, was entirely just an intelligence. A front for intelligence.
There's also
things like the Washington Post, the New York Post, loads and loads and loads of the American media is
William
just
F. Buckley with the National Review. There's rumors that the initial grant that he got to start that might have been from the
I think
CIA.
Buckley was, and so just the internet is just an extension of that. It's just the next generation of that.
But it's explaining why it is that for so long the internet was this Wild West zone of complete free speech.
Because the powers that be wanted it that way.
And now it's changing and it's flipping around. And this is the only other clip that I'm going to play, but I would really recommend anybody who wants to know more, because he actually goes into detail of the processes by how they achieve this.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I haven't watched it. I will watch it later.
It's a really fantastic watch. If you've got friends who might be interested in it, share it to them as well. But here's the next one, because he's now talking about NATO-US collusion with the European Union to initially try to prevent Brexit, and then try to prevent right-wing populist uprisings in European countries, to try and dissuade people and spread information and censor people who would want you to vote for those parties.
And NATO at that point declared something that they first called the Gerasimov Doctrine, which is named after this Russian military general, who they claimed made a speech that the fundamental nature of war has changed. You don't need to win military skirmishes to take over Central and Eastern Europe. All you need to do is control the media and the social media ecosystem, because that's what controls elections. And if you simply get the right administration into power, they control the military. So it's infinitely cheaper than conducting a military war to simply conduct an organized political influence operation over social media and legacy media. An industry had been created that spanned the Pentagon, the British Ministry of Defense, and Brussels into a organized political warfare outfit, essentially infrastructure that was created, initially stationed in Germany and in Central and Eastern Europe, to create psychological buffer zones, basically to create the ability to have the military work with the social media companies to censor Russian propaganda or to censor domestic right-wing populist groups in Europe who were rising in political power at the time because of the migrant crisis. So you had the systematic targeting by our State Department, by our IC, by the Pentagon, of groups like Germany's AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland there, and for groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Now, when Brexit happened in 2016, that was this crisis moment where suddenly they didn't have to worry just about Central and Eastern Europe anymore. It was coming westward, this idea of Russian control over hearts and minds. And so Brexit was June 2016. The very next month at the Warsaw Conference, NATO formally amended its charter to expressly commit to hybrid warfare as this new NATO capacity. So they went from, basically 70 years of tanks to this explicit capacity building for censoring tweets if they were deemed to be Russian proxies. And again, it's not just Russian propaganda. These were now Brexit groups, or groups like Matteo Salvini in Italy, or in Greece, or in Germany, or in Spain with the Vox Party. And now at the time, NATO was publishing white papers saying that the biggest threat NATO faces is not actually a military invasion from Russia. It's losing domestic elections across Europe to all these right-wing populist groups who, because they were mostly working-class movements, were campaigning on cheap Russian energy at a time when the U.S. was pressuring this energy diversification policy. And so they made the argument, after Brexit, now the entire rules-based international order would collapse unless the military took control over media, because Brexit would give rise to Frexit in France with Marine Le Pen, to Spexit in Spain with the Vox Party, to Italexit in Italy, to Grexit in Germany, to Grexit in Greece. The EU would come apart, so NATO would be killed without a single bullet being fired. And then not only that, now that NATO's gone, now there's no enforcement arm for the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank. So now the financial stakeholders who depend on the battering ram of the national security state would basically be helpless against governments around the world. So from their perspective, if the military did not begin to censor the internet, all of the democratic institutions and infrastructure that gave rise to the modern world after World War II would collapse. So you can imagine the reaction.
May I ask you to pause
later, Donald Trump won the 2016 election.
So you just told a remarkable story that I've never heard anybody explain as lucidly and crisply as you just did. But did anyone at NATO or anyone at the State Department pause for a moment and say, wait a second, we've just identified our new enemy as democracy within our own countries? I think that's what you're saying. They feared that the people, the citizens of their own countries, would get their way, and they went to war against that.
Yes.
There you go. Yes.
It's just interesting. It's funny to me, brilliant, that Nigel not only screwed over the European Parliament, but also the State Department, the Pentagon, the IMF, basically all,
without realizing,
all the most sinister powers in the whole world are peed off at Nige. That's great.
And if you wonder why there seemed to be such a shift in discourse that went on around 2014, 2015, 2016, because everybody says that that's when the woke discussion ramped up, it might be something to do with the fact that this was the time when these state apparatus started to really go into overdrive to censor the other side. And all of a sudden, online discourse changed because this kind of the woke nonsense was able to have a much greater platform than it did before because the system was on its side, whereas, as we know, the system is not and has never been on our side. There is a question that you need to ask yourself, though, watching this, which is, okay, he's just laid out this entire story, which I think, is true. The evidence that I've seen prior to it all seems to paint it as true. But how does he get this? How does Tucker Carlson get this online without it immediately being taken down? If there's this enormous censorship apparatus, and I think it might have something to do with the fact that Tucker is obviously backed by Elon Musk. So Elon Musk has Tucker's back. And Elon Musk, as we've discussed before, is deeply embedded with the US government anyway, because all of his infrastructure with SpaceX and other companies that he owns, the US government, because of the complete competency crisis it's going under in its own departments, is entirely reliant on Elon Musk's companies for any kind of innovation, for even remotely being able to look to space again. They are entirely reliant on Elon Musk. So Elon Musk is backing Tucker, has his own financial capital behind him, and also has a certain level of the US government reliant on him. So Elon, in supporting this, I think there might be other answers to it. You might be able to come up with other reasons for this. Elon might have Tucker's back on this and be saying to the sorts of departments that might be censoring him normally and say, you have to let at least some of this go out. That might have something to do with it, as far as I can tell. Do you have anything?
There's no way you'd be allowed to do something, as one example, like Starlink, without the American defense monolith allowing you to do it. So, yeah.
But yeah, so Jon Stewart is still a shill for the regime, and Tucker Carlson is hosting mind-blowing interviews like this, so who's really winning?
If you appreciated that episode from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Brokenomics series, this episode on the Putin interview. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Twitter at lotuseaters_com on Twitter. Thank you and goodbye.